What began as a show of force in Syria is turning into regime change, which leads to nation building, and that's after protracted conflicts, civilian casualties, and unacceptable levels of debt from an administration that won't tackle entitlement reform in this country. So if Syrians are entitled to a better leader, why are we supposed to do the dirty work and ultimately pay the price for making Syria great again? The president had it right when he was skeptical about a prolonged conflict in another Middle East country by diving into Syria. In 2013, President Trump not only questioned the cost in blood and treasure of such an undertaking, but also the constitutional authority of single-branch action in another crowded theater. Russia still backs chinless dictator Bashar al-Assad, and deposing him won't happen with Russia riding in our war-happy sidecar. Our Secretary of State has echoed National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster's longing to overthrow the murderous bastard, but it remains to be seen how keen his diplomatic powers are when Tillerson visits Russia this week to try to convince Putin setting his national interests aside and riding in the back seat are an ideal outcome. Now, other than proxifully provoking a nuclear power, the United States also has to consider what our Syria policy is and if anyone is rationally bending the president's tin ear. The well-intentioned Tomahawk shower was widely praised, but stopping a room full of generals from flexing their Delta Force is like telling a fat kid to stick to a bowl of broccoli at a buffet. There are too many looming questions before we further wade into the Mideast mire. When Assad is deposed, who is his rightful heir, other than ISIS or some other incarnation of murderous theocrats flush with U.S. weapons? Why are his overthrow and ISIS's defeat now considered the same thing? And how can these things be done simultaneously without congressional approval? Now, I'm no foreign policy expert, but overthrowing strongmen has not ended well so far for us or for their countries. And groups like ISIS blossom in the kind of chaotic vacuums that we're on the verge of creating again. All I ask is for a few simple questions to be answered before we go down the complex road to nowhere of debt and death that only lead to making America bad again. You're very good, and you're here, and I'm glad. I'm Kennedy. So what is the White House plan for Syria? Defeat ISIS, remove Assad? According to White House National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, it's both.
There has to be a degree of simultaneous activity as well as a sequencing of the defeat of ISIS first. What you have in Syria is a very destructive cycle of violence, perpetuated by ISIS, obviously, but also by this regime and their Iranian and Russian sponsors.
But today, the White House said the airstrikes were to prevent the spread of chemical weapons. And now Russia and Iran are saying that they will retaliate if the U.S. continues strikes on the Assad regime. So are we getting in over our head here? Dr. Ron Paul joins me. He's the host of the Ron Paul Liberty Report. Welcome back, Dr. Paul.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
So obviously, someone who gasses their own people and kills babies is a bad person. I think we can all universally agree on that. But the question really is, when and how does the U.S. get involved?
Well, certainly not under fake news, and I think a lot of fake news is floating around because nobody's proven anything about who gassed whom. And of course, you know, in 2013, they were claiming that Assad gassed his own people. And it turns out, as the dust settled, the UN comes up with a report and said it was the rebels that had the gas. So I haven't bought into this. But the whole thing is intervention is intervention. Intervention is bad if it's not done, you know, for our national defense. But the president gives us the answer. He says our vital national security interests prompted him to do this, and this was very necessary. I think the only interest that's been involved here is to prop up the profits of the military-industrial complex. That's what they think that's what they think national security interests are all about. But no, we don't need to be in there. It's a mess. Just remember, ISIS and Al-Qaeda were virtually out of there until we define our policy as Assad has to go under Obama. Things have just totally deteriorated since then, but they never mentioned that. They just mentioned, oh, Assad, you know, does this and that, and he's far from a saint.
I think I disagree with you about the idea that Assad wouldn't gas his own people. I think he's a horrible person. He hates freedom, and he would kill and murder his own people to further his own grasp on power. That's what I think about that, but I also agree with you that getting further into the Middle East, and also there is no end game. You know, when people try and give us these pat, oversimplified statements of comfort that somehow this is the only thing we're going to do and then we're going to get out, and then the next thing, the next business day, essentially what you hear is we're going to get rid of Assad and we're also going to get rid of ISIS. I mean, those are massive undertakings that at some point require congressional consent and a new AUMF. If you were still in Congress, what would you say to the president about that?
I would say get out, get them, bring them home, and as soon as possible, because we don't have any business being there. If we're concerned about killing people, what about the 500,000 kids that were supposed to have been killed 10 years of bombing in Iraq? And Albright says, oh, well, if that's the price we have to pay, that's the price we have to pay. So it has nothing to do with killing. It has to do with war propaganda and sinister forces that like war, and that's the neoconservative movement. So the neoconservatives politically are winning, but I believe the American people are still with us who believe that this war is absolutely unnecessary. You say he's a monster. Maybe so. But I don't think he's exactly what they portray him to be. You know, Saddam Hussein was a monster too, but he didn't have weapons of mass destruction. This is war propaganda, and this is making excuses to get involved in things that we shouldn't be involved in.
Even if it's not war propaganda, I will agree with you that deposing these people leaves vacuums that tend to be much worse, and instead of getting resolved, and certainly not to the benefit of our country or the region as a whole. And, you know, regardless of how you specifically make the case, it's almost impossible to make a strong argument that we should continue any incursions in the Middle East, whether it be Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, or Libya. Dr. Paul, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Well,
go ahead. Go ahead. Last word. Go ahead.
Well, no, I say you're right, and I approach it constitutionally and morally, and we shouldn't be involved. And you mentioned a few reasons, for practical reasons, we shouldn't be involved, because it really doesn't accomplish anything. What have we accomplished in 15 years of constant war in the Middle East? And adding another war doesn't help us at all. So I would say practically, morally, and constitutionally, we ought not to be there. And the sooner we wake up, the better off the whole world will be.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Paul. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay.
All right. Let me take the crisis in Syria to tonight's Combat Ready Party panel. It's Reason Magazine's editor-in-chief, Catherine Mangu-Ward, joined by Observer columnist Michael Malice, also the author of the North Korean treatise, dear reader. We'll call it that. And U.S. News editor at the Wall Street Journal, Glenn Hall, is also here. Welcome, everyone. He just made a funny noise. Okay, Glenn, I will start with you, because foreign policy obviously now is dominating the news cycle and this presidency. Do you think there's something to what Dr. Paul was saying about maybe not having all the facts in, but certainly being a more convenient narrative for this administration?
Well, I think one of the things that got Donald Trump elected was his tough talk against ISIS. And I think people do live in a certain amount of fear in the United States about what kind of domestic terrorism may be brought over. They'd like to see something be done about that. And so I think this all ties into that. Now, whether it's about regime change, I don't think that's the priority. The administration has taken a few pains today to say our first priority is defeating ISIS. And I think that is a priority that the American people by and large would support. I'm not sure everybody's on board about regime change as a motive for our activities.
Yeah, I don't know that the president is necessarily on board with that, but he certainly has a number of people around him who are strongly making that case. And, you know, I don't know how more people don't see this as being disastrous and having bad outcomes.
There's two points I'd make very quickly. They couldn't repeal and replace Obamacare correctly, and now they're going to repeal and replace someone in a country that most Americans can't find the map, where there isn't a second party, let alone a third party. The second party is the Islamic State. This is madness. And every single cretin in the corporate press who is cheering this attack can't wait to turn their backs on President Trump and make fun of him and humiliate him when it becomes a quagmire and disaster. This is one of the stupidest things he could have done, and It takes a lot for me to get actually livid because I'm an anarchist and I hate politics in general.
Yeah.
But war is the worst thing that any government can do. And the idea that we're going to have more military coffins because of a civil war that's been going on over there where there are no good guys is absolutely demented.
Well, and also, you know, you make the point about the corporate press. And what have they said about this president and collusion with Moscow? And now they're deriding the administration for possibly getting into a hot war with Russia. Can they have it both ways?
Of course, all they care about is blood and suffering, and they're desperate for another FDR, Woodrow Wilson. How many bodies were lost? Meanwhile, when Thatcher and Reagan end the Cold War without a shot being fired, they're dismissed and swept into the dustbin of history by these people. It's disgusting.
All right, are you surprised by the shift toward militarism from a president who talked a lot about the mistakes we've made in the Middle East and being essentially, aside from ISIS, non-interventionist?
So this is, I mean, Donald Trump of almost exactly a year ago described the administration's current policy as idiocy and madness. Those were his own words a year ago, that the idea that we should be simultaneously fighting ISIS and trying to effect regime change in Syria is, he was right the first time. It's essentially idiocy and madness. And, you know, it takes a lot for me to find myself saying Donald Trump is right and then finishing that sentence in any way, but old Donald Trump is right, new Donald Trump is wrong. And I think, you know, Michael is right that this weird moment where everyone says, like, hey, welcome to the club, you're a real president now, congratulations on the bombings. It's like a Hallmark card sentiment.
The big question now is what happens next, right? So if it's just these missile strikes, that hasn't gone as far as you guys are suggesting it might, and how, you know, that could be a different dynamic than we sent a signal and now we move on.
There are 4 long years ahead, though, right? Even if it's just these missile strikes right now, it's a repeat play. This is something that he can't.
I think it's like a late-stage alcoholic having a sip of vodka and then being expected to drive a bus full of kids home later in the night. It's not going to happen. A number of military analysts are claiming the missile attack on Syria was also intended to be a warning to North Korea. Comes amid word that a U.S. Navy strike group, complete with an aircraft carrier, is heading toward the Korean peninsula. Now, last week, NBC News reported that the Trump administration now has several options for dealing with the communist regime there, among them sending some nuclear weapons to South Korea as a deterrent and plans to assassinate Kim Jong-un. So will this get worse before it gets better? Michael, you've obviously spent time in North Korea. How does this play out?
I mean, apoplexy is an understatement because the administration has been far more bellicose towards North Korea than they've been towards Syria. And the fact that we've bombed Syria, as I've told you before on the show, there are 100 to 200,000 people in concentration camps in North Korea right now who are told explicitly and constantly, if the Americans invade, we're going to kill you all. They have nukes. They've had nukes since the 90s. They could have hit Seoul since the 60s. There's no question, in my mind at least, that the regime would enact nuclear retribution.
Yeah.
Kim Jong-il, when he was alive, after Romania fell, he showed footage of the Romanian leader Ceausescu being killed to all the leaders of the party and said, if the masses rebel, you personally are going to be killed. This is your fate. So they know if they're going down personally, and they will be killed with their families, and they will absolutely go down fighting. They've been waiting for this for decades.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And, you know, people talk about economic sanctions on North Korea, but this is not a rational
And let me make one more point.
Yeah.
All the North Korean news media right now are showing the footage of us swarming in and coming to finish the job we started in the 50s from their perspective, and it's factual footage that they're showing them.
Glenn?
You know, this is a two-pronged dynamic that we're dealing with, where, you know, in both cases we're starting a kind of proxy initiative against another major superpower. So in Syria, it's target up against Russia. How far are you willing to go in that conflict? Here, with North Korea, they're nominally backed by the Chinese. Another difficult arrangement for us to engage in. But I think you're absolutely right. This is a very, very treacherous move here in terms of, like, what might provocation of North Korea result in. Very different than what is still a more contained conflict in the Middle East.
Yeah, and there is still a diplomatic relationship with Russia, you know, a nuclear power. There is not one with North Korea. Last word, Catherine.
I love the idea that this is all potentially going to hinge around which anniversary North Korea chooses to celebrate. A bunch of the coverage has said, like, oh, well, you know, it's been 105 years since this and 87 years since that, and maybe they'll use that as the occasion to, like, make a bold move in honor of their previous. And you know, just the extent to which it is such a sort of a cult of personality that it is so dependent on a single decision maker, and that we don't know exactly what the provocation will be, but something like this could surely be it to tip them over.
Yeah, and the fact that it's tied to an anniversary, it shows that they are oddly sentimental, but it's almost guaranteed to end badly. I mean, it's heartbreaking because you know, the president has talked about being moved by those images of Syrian kids being killed by sarin gas, those babies, but you know, how many babies die in those North Korean concentration camps?
Kim Jong-il during his lifetime said the way to deal with America is to go up to her and slap her across the face. And when he was, the mythology there is he got picked to be Supreme Commander by his dad because he said, if they attack North Korea, we will destroy the world. And his father, Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea, said, spoken like a true Supreme Commander. So they revel in the idea of disproportionate retaliation.
Yeah, and taking the world down with them.
Yes.
Absolutely. All right, the party panel returns a little later.